All right, it's a great pleasure to be here and to see everybody coming out today to think more about how we can improve the ways we're serving our English learner students. As Maria Paz mentioned, I started my career as a middle school teacher, which means that if I see you chewing gum and I shoot you a dirty look, I apologize in advance. It's just an instinct that I can't get rid of. So in my time as a middle school teacher, teaching English language learners, working as an ESL teacher, as a literacy teacher for students who were linguistically diverse and bilingual and struggling with reading in various ways, I found that I wasn't prepared to meet my students' needs in a lot of ways, that my teacher credentialing coursework, professional development that was sort of in general ideas about literacy instruction and about instructional design and so on weren't really equipping me with the proper tools. So I would do as you're doing. I would seek out professional development opportunities. I'd seek out ways of learning more. And what I found sometimes was that the advice I got was either very vague, sort of platitudes about making sure that students feel comfortable and that we're responsive to students' needs, or what I received was, here's a worksheet to use tomorrow. But what I didn't seem to get were overarching principles for thinking about instruction that were then illustrated with specific practices. And so one reason I'm proud of the work on the practice guide and proud of the work that everyone has put into this is that I think it really provides a framework for thinking about principles of effective instruction that are illustrated with very specific practices and recommendations. I think it's the kind of tool or the kind of practice guide that's not a checklist of things to do, but is also not sort of vague platitudes to think about. Instead, it's the kind of tool that I think teachers can take back to their schools, instructional teams can take back and discuss how can we put some of these things into place, how can we adapt them for our students in our setting, and how can we really advance our students' skills in this way. So I should say that this work is a labor of love of a variety of people coming together and trying to think through these problems. So the panel involved a number of researchers based in universities with expertise on language development, on bilingualism, on early childhood, on adolescence, and so on, as well as folks who are actively working in classrooms and districts. And what I liked about this group, I think, we didn't always sort of come to things from exactly the same perspective. We often had some challenging conversations about, well, what's the best way to translate, what's the best way to engage teachers in thinking about these kinds of ideas from research. But I think what we ultimately came up with was a set of recommendations, a set of ideas that I think can be very powerful. So today I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to start a little bit big picture, thinking about the 21st century landscape and what our classrooms, the influences on our classrooms today. I'm going to do a little bit of background on literacy development and linguistic diversity, which will be, for many of you, just a refresher or sort of a reminder, but trying to situate these recommendations and thinking about important ideas about literacy development. And then I'll talk about the first two recommendations in the guide. The first focused on academic vocabulary instruction, and the second focused on integrating English language instruction to content area teaching. So when we think about classrooms today, I don't need to tell any of you that the notion of that linguistic diversity is something that only some teachers need to think about, or that only some classrooms, a characteristic of only some classrooms, is no longer true. That throughout the country, throughout the state, throughout in all sorts of settings, in urban settings and rural settings and so on, that we have a huge increase in the levels and the richness of linguistic diversity in our classrooms. We know that although Spanish is overwhelmingly a very prominent language, we know that hundreds of languages are spoken across the country and in many cities and towns. We also know that as we think about demographic changes across the U.S., that the large projected increases in the U.S. population are will be due to immigration, will be due to both immigrant students and the children of immigrant students over time. And so the notion that this is just an ESL teacher's job, or this is just a concern for certain schools or certain neighborhoods, I think is no longer the case, right? that instead we have to think about linguistic diversity as a great opportunity that we have throughout any given state, throughout Connecticut, throughout the Northeast, and that we have to think about the opportunities as well as the ways that we need to reshape and rethink about our instruction. We know when we think about English learners and we think about children in immigrant families that the large number of children in immigrant families are born in the U.S., are educated in the U.S., and that the nature of linguistic diversity is not just a matter of thinking about students who are new to the country and new to English, but that students have a whole range of experiences with two languages at home and at school. When we think about, of course, the great opportunities and the great richness that comes with linguistic diversity, which I don't have to tell you about because you work with it and benefit from it every day, also comes with, of course, a variety of challenges, in part because linguistic diversity in this country overlaps to a large extent with some of the challenges involved in growing up in poverty. So when we think about English learners, we're thinking about students who, by definition, by category, have underdeveloped English skills in some ways, that students will have a wide variety in both their English skills but also in their primary language skills. We know good research suggesting that there are, of course, cognitive advantages to bilingualism that can play out in instruction in a variety of ways, as well as sort of heightened awareness of metalinguistics, of thinking about language itself, not just sort of having the implicit language proficiency. That overlaps with a number of challenges related to growing up in poverty. So thinking about the acute and chronic stressors that are involved in the kinds of stress that families growing up in poverty face, emotional and social challenges that are involved, and language environments that may be mismatched to the language of schools in a variety of ways. This is also contextualized often in schools that are under-resourced in certain ways, or under-resourced at least in the kinds of resources that they may need to work with their students, schools that are often segregated as well, which leads to its own set of challenges in thinking about how to promote language development. And that this leads to outcomes that we're quite familiar with in terms of limited opportunities to develop more advanced literacy skills, the kinds of college and career-ready skills that students will need, high rates of special education placement, and high dropout rates. And when we look at test scores, we see that our English learners are struggling in many ways, and that these achievement gaps, as they're often called, are really highlighting what are underlying opportunity gaps in some ways, right? Persistent opportunity gaps that are involved in the opportunities to learn the sophisticated literacy skills that students will need. So when we turn to thinking about literacy development, particularly among English learners, I think there are a few things to sort of keep in mind. And as I said, this is probably a refresher for many of you, but I think it's worth sort of refreshing or getting on the same page with some of these ideas. So starting with this big question, kind of what is reading? And folks have sort of argued about this over many years. I think that when we think about this text, so this is something like a 5th grade text about a high-speed train and different high-speed trains in different countries in their history. There's a variety of ways we can think about the skills that go into reading this text in a thoughtful and successful way. Of course, there are skills involved in manipulating the letters and sounds in these words. So recognizing that speed has 4 sounds, that we need to break that into 4 sounds. We need to match those to these letter patterns, that it's not going to match 1-to-1, that the sound E is going to have 2 letters spelling it out. These are some of the early challenges. We recognize that this word high is in a family of words, along with sigh and thigh, where the IGH always makes the same sound. And that ultimately we want students to become automatic with these skills so that by, say, 5th grade, they can read 115 words correctly per minute. So these are foundational skills that all students need to acquire and get to a certain level of automaticity in, and that for English learners, they need to do this as well. Oh no. Just press no? Okay. But I think that in many ways, our primary school teachers certainly and have had a focus on these kinds of skills over time, right? So not just for English learners, but all sorts of initiatives have helped us think about early reading instruction to do well in these skills. And I think we've seen a fair amount of progress in helping students acquire these skills. But of course, reading is far more than that, Reading involves all of the other kinds of much broader skills involved in having the strategies to make sense of the text you're reading, not just sound out the words, to have the interest and motivation to persist in reading even when it gets hard, even when we may not have all of the background knowledge we need to make sense of a text very quickly and easily. We need the vocabulary and the understanding of language more broadly to make sense of the text. So just as an example here, so it's one thing to sound out the word high or speed. It's another thing to know that a passenger service, and this word service has 14 meanings, and to figure out which is the meaning that's appropriate here, right? That's a whole nother task, right? And it's a task that's not in some ways quite as simple or sort of direct as teaching students to sound out the word service or speed. So one way to think about this is two different problem spaces. By problem spaces, I mean sort of areas, sets of skills that students have to wrestle with and have to solve a set of problems. So code-based skills are all of these sort of basic skills, foundational skills that go into reading words automatically and fluently. And then meaning-based, or in some cases knowledge-based skills, involved all of these somewhat higher order skills involved in having the vocabulary, the background knowledge, the language understanding, and so on to successfully comprehend text. I think that distinction is important because, of course, both contribute to reading and writing and have a support in and a foundation in listening and speaking. But when we think about English learners, we know from research that actually these two set problem spaces are somewhat different, play out somewhat different for students reading in their second language. So for code-based skills, we know that English learners must learn these skills just as native English speakers do in the English code, and that some will certainly struggle. However, they do not struggle any more often or any more likely to struggle than monolinguals are. So you may have students, certainly, and I'm sure you know of students, who are still struggling to sound out the code in 3rd grade or 5th grade. And they do need intervention and supports, and Patrick will talk a little bit about thinking about that with recommendation 4, but that they're not any more likely to struggle with these skills than anyone else is. They may not necessarily need much more time or much more intensity of instruction in these code-based skills. However, when we think about meaning and knowledge, and we think about particularly students reading again in their second language, that many English learners will struggle with this problem space when they're working in English. That it's a much larger problem space. It involves much more experiences built up incrementally over time, in which we're not just learning new labels, in which we're not just learning sort of sets of language tools, but we're also learning the deep concepts underneath those. The other piece, and one thing I'm very excited about the practice guide, is that it does extend into middle school, which is an area in which I don't think we always knew as much. And as we think about that trajectory, as we think about students over time, we have to recognize, of course, that our English learners are aiming toward a moving target, right? That what it means to be academically proficient in English, what it means to be a successful reader of sophisticated text changes over time. So even if you looked at some texts about trains, the 1st grade text would look like this, be quite short, look a lot like narrative. It would sound in many ways like oral conversation does. By 5th grade, we've got a more sophisticated text. It's starting to look more like informational expository text. It's starting to look a little less like oral conversation. It's getting a little further away from that. And by high school, it looks very bizarre in certain ways, right? It looks quite complicated. It deals with complex ideas, the idea of a relatively powerless federal government. We're capturing complexities and abstraction, all in this encoded in this academic language. And so as we think about those changing text demands, they change both with grade level as students move up the grades, but also they're changing over time as we think about the Common Core and emphasis on text complexity. So the demands of what a high school graduate needs to be able to read successfully has changed over the last few years, and certainly over the last few decades, so that our expectations for what students need to be able to do have increased, right? And I think that's a good thing. I think we're raising standards in a really powerful way. But I think that also comes with new challenges for thinking about what are those demands of the text and what are the ways we can help our students reach them. So with that, I can turn to the recommendations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about recommendation 1 and 2. As MP said, I'll be talking a little more about recommendation 1 in my breakout session. Raise your hand if anybody had heard of so this is the actual second version of this practice guide. The first version came out in 2007. Raise your hand if you heard of that. Okay, so a number of folks actually. So this was an attempt to take the practice guide in 2007, which had been only focused on elementary school, and to ramp it up to middle school, as well as to update the recommendations about all the grades to incorporate the most recent research evidence. It is unique, I think, among a lot of resources that teachers have. I also think the other thing that sort of sets this practice guide aside is that it is really based on what many consider the sort of most rigorous, or at least under a certain paradigm, kind of the most rigorous research evidence. So what that means is that this practice guide it's actually based in some ways on a medical model of thinking about teachers as being professionals like doctors are, and that part of the challenge of being effective teachers is to use evidence-based practices. So use practices in which instruction has been compared not just to see, well, if we teach the students, are they learning more, but if we teach the students in one way, are they learning more than if we taught them in a different way? So the first recommendation is to teach a set of academic vocabulary words intensively across several days using a variety of instructional activities. I think that we often think about vocabulary, and certainly for English learners, it becomes very obvious that they're struggling with certain vocabulary words. But how do we think about that in a robust way? How do we think about teaching a relatively small set of words, but intensively, so that students are not just learning the labels, but learning the concepts? How do we get them to use a variety of activities so students can really engage with these words? The evidence for this recommendation was strong, which means that we had multiple studies which met sort of very rigorous standards for research. These studies were conducted, most of them in the upper elementary and middle school grades, so in some ways this recommendation is probably most applicable to those grades, although there was one study in the primary grades, and I certainly think the general principles I'll be talking about apply across the span from pre-K to 8th grade. What it'll look like may look a little different, of course, with the grades. And most of these studies, almost all of these studies, were conducted in settings where there were both English learners and native English speakers. So settings where there was integration and the opportunities for students to interact. So what does this mean for teaching? Well, there are sort of 4 big instructional elements in this recommendation for putting vocabulary instruction into place. The first starts with text selection and using rich and engaging texts. So if you look at the research, one thing you find is that even among two sort of highly educated college adults, when they speak with each other, they use the same 2,000 words over and over again, right? Oral conversation's it can be a great mechanism for working with new words, but it's not necessarily going to generate rich academic words just in and of itself. And so we have to think about text and basing our vocabulary instruction in text, in part because the language of text is quite different than what oral conversation is like. So in thinking about text selection, we need to think about engagement and texts that have rich ideas, and often, we can think about controversial topics. We can think about texts that relate in many ways to students' experiences at whatever grade level they're at, and using that as then a platform for contextualizing our vocabulary instruction. In selecting words, and I think this is a real consensus point in the vocabulary research over the last really 20 or 30 years, that focusing on a small set of words, but teaching them in an in-depth way and in a way that provides opportunities to practice strategies that can be applied to other words is the best approach. So the approach in which we think about a long list of vocabulary and we teach words and definitions and we don't do much with them, I think we've seen has not been very effective. Thinking about teaching academic vocabulary in depth using multiple modalities. So pushing students not just to receptively understand a word, not just match a word with a definition or a synonym or an example, but having students read a word in multiple contexts, write with the word, speak with the word actively, with a partner in classroom debates and so on, I think is really essential. And then that we're not just teaching students specific words, but we're teaching them strategies so that they can independently figure out the meanings of words. One thing we know is that for all of our students, the word learning challenge is huge. Students need to learn thousands of words a year. And our English learners often need to learn many more to catch up with their peers. And so although we should invest time in directly teaching a small set of words, we also need to equip students to think about words and to think about language in an active way so that they can pick up many of these other words more independently and can be more successful at word learning. So let me say a little bit about each of these steps. First, when we think about choosing texts and words, the first step involves, as I mentioned, this idea of choosing a brief but engaging piece of text. Many of these studies think about informational text because it provides opportunities for thinking about new concepts in a new way. It also often, the academic words in informational text often reappear more often in some cases than they do in narrative text. One way I think about this is that it's texts and ideas that are worth talking about. So if you want to get your students talking, you want to get your students talking using more sophisticated academic language, start with things that will get them to talk. Start with things that will get them engaged and get them to talk not just in the ways that they talk on the playground, not just in the way they talk in the cafeteria, but talk about rich ideas, right? Second is to choose a small set of academic vocabulary for in-depth instruction. And here I think we want to think about high utility words, and this may echo things you've heard in other contexts and from other kinds of professional development. But often when I go into classrooms, and we've done some research on this where we've seen, particularly in middle school classrooms, the teachers know they need to teach vocabulary, and teachers are sort of well-intentioned focused on that. But if they don't have opportunities to be planful about it, what they end up doing is they end up picking out a word that sounds interesting, sounds colorful. We know our students don't know it, but it may not be the most useful word, right? So thinking about high utility vocabulary means taking some time to plan and decide, are these the words that are going to be most useful, not just to understanding this text, but to understanding other texts that students will encounter. And I don't think that's an easy task. I think that requires collaboration and planning time. But I think it's a really important task so that our vocabulary instruction is not just in the moment, it's not just one-off, it's not highlighting words that students might not know, but they might not necessarily need either. And then when we think about teaching vocabulary in depth, using multiple modalities, we're thinking about all sorts of different opportunities. And I'm sure if we polled the room, you'd have lots of ways in which you think about this, having structured discussions in which students use the words, having role-playing activities, and so on. All sorts of ways in which we can think about that. The key principle here, I think, is that you're getting multiple ways of working with the words, not just in reading, but in writing, not just in speaking, but in listening, and that you're doing that in a way that helps students process them in a deep way, to really take ownership of these words. And these are just sort of examples of those. I think the practice guide, I'll refer you here to the practice guide. I think it is worth reading closely this section at some point because they do a nice job of, each of these pieces are illustrated through a classroom example. So you see really how a teacher can put these ideas of multiple modalities into place. The last step here for academic vocabulary instruction is thinking about word learning strategies, so that students can ultimately figure out the meanings of words on their own. And we know from research that a number of strategies are helpful and that combining strategies is also helpful. So thinking about context clues, using the context. And we know that in some cases contexts are not as supportive as they should be, and that for English learners, they may not always understand the ways in which the context is playing out. But I think when we're strategic about context clues, when we choose examples and choose contexts where they're actually going to be quite helpful for students, they can be very effective. We have a number of research studies now that suggest that using word parts and breaking words down can be really beneficial, and that this is one way in which, as I mentioned earlier, these advantages of bilingualism, the ways in which bilingualism helps students think about language more metalinguistically, can help them in many ways when they encounter morphology and word parts. So this is a way in which we can leverage that strength to help students acquire many more words. So working with investigated investigation, having contextualized opportunities to rewrite sentences, to use new word forms, and so on. And then building on this notion of bilingual advantages and the first language resources that students bring is thinking about, of course, about cognates and the ways in which words have relationships across languages. Of course, in many Romance languages, this can be really benefit because often a very common word in Spanish, for instance, a very frequent word in Spanish relates to a much more academic word in English. So one of the sort of nice historical things about English for students who speak other Romance languages is that our Latin and Greek words are the more academic words, right? When you look at the academic word list, you often see many, many words that are cognates, and that's in part because they're based on Latin and Greek, whereas the Germanic words in English are often the less academic, the more everyday or colloquial words. And so quite frequent words in Spanish or in another Romance language can be actually really helpful because they can match to quite academic words in English. Second recommendation is to think about integrating oral and written English language instruction into content area teaching. And I think we've been talking about these ideas for a long time. We've been talking about the ways that language and literacy need to be infused into content area teaching and vice versa. I think that with things like the Common Core standards, but also all sorts of efforts, we need to start thinking more deeply about what this means and how to put this into place. I think when I was a middle school teacher, for sure, I noticed that my students would come to my class and they would do sort of, often we would work with informational text and we would do work around English language development, but then they'd go to a science class and they'd get something completely different that was sort of isolated and quite disconnected. And that, particularly in middle schools, but I think this happens in upper elementary grades as well sometimes, when we ask students to move from one class to another, we're asking them to sort of navigate those differences themselves. We're asking them to go from one setting in which maybe they have a lot of sort of support for thinking about language to another setting where they're asked to sort of learn content without necessarily those supports. I also think that we need to think more clearly about what the benefits that content area instruction and that instruction in disciplinary learning can offer us. In part, back to my idea of, or back to the notion I mentioned about ideas we're talking about, the content areas offer many of those, right? So formulating language instruction that's absent of content can often be quite boring. It can often be quite abstracted and makes it difficult for students to then transfer it to working with academic content. So I think science and social studies provide these rich opportunities for thinking about ideas in a different way. But that comes then with more challenges in thinking about the language of those content areas. Because I think part of what we need to unpack for students and not leave them on their own to discover is how scientists and historians use language differently. And that those differences can be quite a stumbling block if we're not heightening students' awareness to them. So this recommendation has strong evidence from 5 rigorous studies. It's shown positive impacts on content area learning with some evidence as well on language and reading. 4 of these 5 studies were conducted in intermediate or middle school settings, so somewhat older students, 1 study with younger students. And again, the classrooms were linguistically diverse, containing both English learners and native English speakers. So putting this into place, like I said, I think is quite challenging. In terms of thinking about instructional tools and use, we can think about how to strategically use instructional tools, things like short videos, visuals, graphic organizers. So tools that you're already using, but how do we think about being more strategic about them? One way to think about that is to think about anchoring instruction. So what I mean by this is that if you imagine a thematic unit, to start with a short video clip, which is engaging and provocative, that video clip can provide an opportunity to build some shared knowledge, build some shared conversations, that then as your instruction becomes further away from that clip, you can return to those discussions, to return to that background knowledge, and having had that shared experience. I think one thing we know from language research, from the earliest child learning studies, is that having shared experiences is really important to making language understandable, right? So parents with their 1-year-olds, there can be a lot of shared context. We can point to the same object so that when a child points at something, the parent knows what they're referring to. The problem with academic language is we don't have that kind of concrete thing we're referring to, right? Instead, we need to think about the way that something like a video, something like a well-designed graphic organizer can be that reference, can be that thing we all point to when we're talking about comparing and contrasting while pointing to a Venn diagram, for instance. And that's not as concrete as a table is for a 1-year-old, but it can serve that same kind of function to anchor our instruction and to make it accessible. Again, as with recommendation 1, we also talk about the importance of vocabulary instruction in content area instruction, and that teachers need to think about both their content-specific academic vocabulary, words like photosynthesis or industrial revolution, but also the general academic vocabulary that supports it. Words like hypothesis and evidence, right? These are words that particularly in middle school and particularly teachers who are thinking more about the content area may take for granted that students know or that they know in a deep way. And that often it's that general academic vocabulary that's also needed to support the content-specific ideas. That we have daily opportunities for students to talk about content in pairs or in small groups. I think, and I'm sure many of you have very language-rich classrooms that are not the kind where students are sitting quietly at their desks. But I think if there's one thing we could kind of push on is increasing those opportunities for talk. And that doesn't mean unstructured. That doesn't mean opportunities for students to sort of talk about whatever they'd like, but that we have daily opportunities for students in pairs or in small groups to talk about rich content in a really active way. And what I think we do see is that when teachers get more focused on content in science and social studies, often the student talk seems to come down. Right? So how do we think about making that focus on content not lead to less focus on students and what they have to say about it and produce? And then writing opportunities, providing writing opportunities to extend student learning and understanding of content. And Patrick will talk a little bit more about writing later this morning. So I think I'll just briefly sort of unpack these. I think, as I mentioned, this idea of anchoring instruction with graphic organizers and strategic use of particular tools. I think one general principle here is that in collaborative groups with other teachers and conversations about instruction, asking, okay, so here's a tool, how are we going to use it strategically? Why are we using it? Are we using it because it's available, or are we using it because it's sort of the best tool in this way? And are there ways we can help students see why a particular graphic organizer is one we always return to when we're doing certain kinds of work? Teaching content-specific vocabulary as well as academic vocabulary, which I mentioned. I think in parallel to recommendation 1, that the notion of daily opportunities for student talk, I think comes up, and it comes up throughout the practice guide, as important regardless of what kinds of instruction you're talking about, whatever your target of instruction is. Having structured discussions in which students use the words will promote vocabulary, as well as providing daily opportunities for talking about content will provide opportunities to work with content in a richer and deeper way. And then providing written opportunities to use words is very much parallel with providing written opportunities to extend your learning of content. I think that if I would say one piece that really ties the first 2 recommendations together, it's this notion of situating our language instruction in ideas that are worth talking about, in concepts that are worth learning in a deep way, that are worth thinking about, challenging, critiquing, and debating. But that while we do that, we also scaffold those opportunities with explicit and strategic supports so that students can work with that content, work with those ideas in ways that really supports them to higher levels of language learning. So with that, I will turn it over to Carrie for questions and answers.
Thank you, Michael. So now we have a few minutes for any questions that you have, and Anne will be walking around with a microphone. If you can raise your hand. Yeah, could you use the mic there?
So I appreciate your talk about what is reading. I am a middle school instructor. So one of the problems we have is when in the day, in terms of their content level area, just in terms of their schedule, when do we practice these with older students, and how do we, balance in terms of, they do need this, in terms of looking at the phonics, in terms of looking at the sounds, but they also need the meaning. And then they have 7 periods, and then it's when in the day, and how, what does research say, how important that is in terms of our upper level, our 6th through 12th grade readers.
Sure. Yeah. And Patrick can jump in on this too, but I think that what we've seen in research is that targeted intervention, and Patrick will talk a little bit about this with the 4th recommendation as well, but targeted intervention for older students who are struggling with code-based skills can be really effective, and that if it's targeted to the right students and delivered in sort of an intensive way, it doesn't often have to take that long, that it can happen over sort of a shorter period of time. It takes a lot of effort to get there. And part of the challenge, I think, is finding the students where it really is a sort of code-based challenge as opposed to a meaning-based or knowledge-based challenge. So I think there are things for students, for instance, even within that problem space, there are students for whom they're really struggling with basic foundational accuracy skills, sounding out words in a very basic way, and then there are students who are struggling with doing it automatically and fluently. I think what we see in research is that there are many more middle school students who are struggling with sort of the fluency piece, with the automatic piece, than it is with the sort of basic accuracy piece. And I think for that, there are lots of ways we can think about fluency instruction in the context of rich content instruction and language instruction, right? So even opportunities to work with a partner and reread a given text can promote fluency. So we know from research that practice, opportunities to reread text, to have support from a peer who can help you with words you're struggling to sound out and decode can be helpful. So finding ways to make sure that you're not just always doing read alouds, you're not just always, although those are valuable as well, of course, but that you're also giving students opportunities to read with a partner out loud, to reread a given text multiple times, to hear how, and to hear for themselves how their reading is becoming more fluent in that text. But I also think for a small number of students who are really struggling with those basic foundational phonics skills of sounding out words, that some supplemental intervention that's done in a small group can be more effective, and can be needed and can kind of set them up for success. It doesn't mean they should spend all day on it, and it doesn't mean they should spend all year on it for sure, but it does mean that fitting in, finding ways in your school structure to kind of pull those students out and do some intensive work with a small group can be helpful.
The other thing is the affordances of digital technologies for pushing on some of these issues. Some of the work that an organization called the Center for Applied Special Technology is doing is with middle school students who struggle with reading, is providing them access to these kinds of engaging, meaningful texts that are informationally based, but also these texts they read themselves aloud while also highlighting the text as they go. So students who work in these environments, we're starting to see effects on fluency simply by participating in the environment where they are reading along while the text is being highlighted. And so sort of getting a sense of the prosody and the pronunciation as they move through the process.
Thank you. Other questions? There's one over there.
I believe you said that teaching reading to a non-English speaking student is basically the same as teaching to an English speaking speaker in terms of decoding?
So I guess I wouldn't say that the instructional techniques are quite the same. I think that the process, we know that many of the same skills that are important for native English speakers are important for bilingual students and English learners. So we know that it's not the case that their reading process in English is entirely different at the level of sounding out words. Instructionally, I think that instruction, many of the general principles of instruction for early reading instruction are the same. But I think at the same time what that's going to have to look like in terms of additional supports, for instance. So teaching students to, if students are in first grade, for instance, and they have a wide English vocabulary of a variety of words, then which words you pick for your phonics instruction is less important, right? You can pick cat and cap and cane, and if students have sort of understanding of those words. If they don't, then you have to be more thoughtful and careful about that, right?
Okay.
And so you have to kind of support that in certain ways. So the instruction can look somewhat different, but I think there's a general sense that the same targets of instruction are important.
Okay, because I see, for example, trying to teach sight words to a Spanish-speaking student would be definitely difficult. And you mentioned the use of cognates, but there's also negative transfer. If I already know how to read in Spanish, I'm going to have a hard time with long versus short vowel sounds and pronunciations of other letters that are not at all existing in my language structure. So.
Right.
I now thank you for clarifying. So
Yeah,
it is different to teach reading to a non-English speaking student.
That's right. Yeah. No, I didn't mean to suggest that sort of the process would be the same. And I think you're right that thinking about students' literacy skills and their biliteracy skills is also quite important as well. And I think because there are many ways in which there are advantages because of overlaps in the reading process in Spanish and English, for instance. But then there are some ways in which there are disconnects, that drawing students' attention to those can be helpful.